Our second speaker this morning is Dr Winnifred Louis. Winnifred is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland, and her research interests focus on the influence of identity and norms on social decision-making. And she studied this broad topic in contexts from politics and community activism to financial decision-making to health choices. She's an honorary research consultant for the Australian Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies and a member of the editorial board of Peace and Conflict, Behavioural Sciences of Terrorism and Political Aggression. She's going to speak to us this morning about household attitudes and behaviours in relation to environmentally sustainable resource use. Please welcome Winnifred.
I know you're now asking yourselves why I'm here, given that I'm an expert on conflict and prejudice. It's because I want to begin by saying that I'm just the muscle woman. I just did the stats for this project. I'm just kidding. Social psychologists argue that a lot of our decision-making models apply across contexts, and so as a result, my collaborator Kelly Fielding and I have quite a lot of work looking at environmental decisions, applying the same kinds of issues of identities and norms that we have in other areas like conflict, prejudice, and health choices. And the kind of take-home message is something that I know you guys probably already know. I have a sense that the action on the ground in this meeting is much more at the level of design and hardware. But it is the case that people can thwart your best intentions. You can have a wonderful technology, you can have a wonderful plan that will create high-density housing that's affordable and so on. But if they won't let you in, if they won't allow you to build, then your problem remains. And it was interesting for me to see in the previous talk that out of the 10 barriers to greyfield development, at least 6 implicated kind of social psychological factors like the NIMBY problem and people's fears and anxieties, or the question of neighborhood character, which has a really interesting psychological aspect. But I won't waffle on too much about that. A lot of the detail that we're going to talk about is in the report written by my colleague Kelly Fielding in collaboration with myself and with other key players from the Ahuri grant that we had, Clive Warren and Alice Thompson. The context where we need to worry about housing and the environment is, of course, a complex one, but one easy window is just to say that households are a site of significant waste, and that's across a number of domains from water and energy to actual physical waste. Energy use is an ongoing and growing problem, and the household sector is increasing its responsibility. Solid waste is increasing from households every year, and of course, consumption is in the billions of dollars of waste. So our research was a one-year project, and what we did is a quantitative survey of Brisbane and Melbourne householders. We had a nice range from, of age and gender, and then there was followed up by interviews with low, medium, and high income respondents in varying household composition, owners versus renters. When we look at the profile of our samples, you can see in the blue bar the Melbourne group, and in the blue bars Brisbane, beige bars Melbourne. So the majority of people are home owners in both cases, but we can see that in Melbourne there's a slightly higher proportion of townhouse and unit and flat respondents, and in Brisbane we can see a slightly higher proportion of rentals. When we look across the demographics for our sample, there's an overrepresentation of the relatively wealthy, as is common in survey research, but we still do get quite a lot of respondents from the lower sociodemographic ranges, and that's important, although I'm not sure I'll have time to talk about it today. Okay, thinking about household sustainability, there are really 2 areas of decision-making that are important. One of them is the curtailment behaviors of the household, and that is your everyday activities. Now, this is an area where people have made significant changes, but as we'll see in a moment, there's still significant shortfalls from a sustainability perspective. The other one is really particularly interesting to bureaucrats and planners, and those are those efficiency behaviors. So that's a one-off decision that you can take to install efficient appliances and devices. So simply putting in a low-flow shower head, for example, can change the profile of water use for a household. And this is an important behavior in the sense that it's relatively low effort sometimes. And one person within a household can make the choice. Whereas with some of these habits, such as taking shorter showers, one recalcitrant teenager can thwart your good intentions as a sustainably minded household leader. So there are differences in the ways that the psychological dynamics unfold, with the efficiency behaviors much more within the control of, for example, the major breadwinner or the person who takes responsibility for those choices. And then there's the curtailment behaviors where people are really influenced by a household culture that is sometimes negotiated, but often out of your individual control. In psychology, it's useful, as you may know, to distinguish between a kind of profile of change as we see a behavior campaign unfold. One issue is what are people's attitudes towards your desired change? For example, do people actually support sustainable decision making? And you'll see in a moment that in both Brisbane and Melbourne, the profile is of very favorable attitudes. So we've passed step one. The next question is, do they think that they can act? And do they have intentions to act? So once you have your positive attitudes, have the intentions been formed? And you'll see in a moment that for the most part, yes, although there are shortfalls in some areas that we'll highlight, particularly around those efficiency behaviors. And one critical factor in the transition from favorable attitudes to actually intending to act is the normative context and the social norms. And believing that other people in the community engage in sustainable actions is a kind of threshold where you can get quite a rapid tipping point. So there can be a kind of climate of favorable, vague intentions, which suddenly crystallizes at a neighborhood level or at a national level or a regional level when everyone starts doing it at once. There are these waves of action. Once people have their strong intentions to take action, the question is, do they translate them into behavior? And there are a number of barriers, and we'll just talk about two. One is changing habits, and the other one is the financial and time constraints that can prevent you from taking action. And I will be highlighting the question about this divergence between water and energy efficiency actions versus everyday actions. And I want to talk a little bit about the economic barriers and people's feeling that they don't always have time, effort, and expertise. This is a dimension where people fork into two camps. In a lot of other areas, you see a nice bell curve distribution where you can see the attitudes. There's a profile with most people moderate and few people at the extremes. But here you see a divergence between some people who are just able, whenever they make the decision, to take the action, whereas other people are experience that they would like to do something in theory, but they don't have the energy and time and perhaps sometimes the money to take that step. And that's a really important window for intervention, right? Because those people, if you reach them, they'll actually do it. Okay, so here's the attitudinal context that I was referring to. And what you can see here are extravagantly positive attitudes across every single domain. So as a researcher, you kind of view this with some suspicion and skepticism, right? But here's a scale from 1 to 7, where 7 is very favorable attitudes. And across the bottom, we can see their attitudes towards water curtailment behaviors, everyday water choices that save, water efficiency, energy curtailment, energy efficiency, and waste minimization. And both samples, every single domain, above 6 on the scale. So attitudes are not the problem. The community is solidly in favor of conservation. So tick. In terms of their intentions, these also look fabulously high, at least from an environmental perspective. Of course, like all researchers, we do have a bias going in that sustainability is a good thing. And now we can compare, though, their level of attitudes to their intentions, and you do see this consistent drop-off from around the middle of 6.5 down to 6 and even below. We can also start talking about differences between the domains and the area of energy efficiency in particular, which is a problem, and that may be of interest to some of you, I'm not sure. Okay. Now we're going to just kind of focus in on each domain in turn and look at where the problems and success stories are. So one issue is that people have really adopted some fabulous conservation habits. At least they're reporting that they are in both Brisbane and Melbourne. And I should say that we did have some behavioral data, but the response rate was so terrible and there was so much noise that we're not even presenting it. We've had another pass at going through and getting contact with their utility companies, and that's a lot more promising in terms of the quality of the data. But here we focus on what they claim that they're doing, and we'll see in a moment that although large majorities of the sample have developed great habits, there's large minorities that still have not. So the major areas that you would say as a sustainability researcher people still need to work on are kind of shower length, gray water, and switching off appliances. Now, when you ask people, why don't you do these good things, I might just ask people in the room, is everyone switching off their appliances at the wall? Look, so I see some people nodding and most people sheepishly avoiding eye contact. Of course, a lot of people would say it's inconvenient, it impacts on your quality of life, and frankly, we have bad habits. There's real generational differences that occur here. Sometimes the kids are a lot more energy conserving, but other times it's the adults because we're conscious of money, If we look at those water-saving curtailment actions, both Brisbane and Melbourne have incredibly high compliance with the car washing. So this is a significant change that environmental researchers have tracked in the last decade. And of course, it relates to the drought context. Many people are turning off the tap when brushing their teeth, running full dishwashers, full loads of washing. Then we start seeing the drop-off, water-wise gardening, half-flush toilets. That just means, we'll see in a moment they've got the toilet installed. What we see here is only about 60% are consistently using the half-flush. So this is another discrepancy between having the device and using it properly. Many people don't fix their leaking taps, which is just a shocking abomination to a sustainability researcher. And of course, short showers are a real point of resistance. When we look at energy, an astounding 20% of people in Melbourne don't close the windows and doors when they're using air conditioning. Having said that, it is a success story in that 80% of people are saying they do close the doors. And if we accept that as a kind of minimal standard of decision making, that's a great thing. And in Brisbane, they don't close the curtains on hot days and cold nights. I mean, here I'm being a little sarcastic. But what you can see is that there's sometimes very sensible decisions that don't take long that have a really significant impact on energy use that people are just not integrating. The majority of people have integrated, that's a success, but then 30 to 20% of people have not integrated. Cold water washing is also unpopular in Melbourne relative to Brisbane, presumably because of the climate difference, although we could talk about that. And then there are many other issues, particularly as we see down at the bottom, the switching off unused electronics and appliances at the power point. Okay, so those habits that people get into contrast with these efficiency actions where sometimes a single action can have an important impact. We need to say, though, that as we've just seen, people will sometimes undermine the impact of their efficient appliances by treating it as a license to waste more energy or water. So it's often the case, for example, that if you have solar power installed, you feel a glow of smugness that then allows you to wastefully use electricity. I mean, that's something we could talk about more. Having said that, very few people install solar. As we'll see, it's the least uptake because of its incredible expense. So here are the water efficient appliances and the profile of their use by our respondents. Dual flush toilets are well taken up, but you can see there's still large minorities that have wasteful single flush. So these are, again, points to do with the age of the houses. Low flow taps and shower heads are also widely used, and water efficient washing machines and irrigation, interestingly, we found this a bit heartening. Shower timers are installed in the majority, the bare majority of houses. And again, we see this discrepancy where people have the timers in their shower, but they're not actually taking short showers. So the technology is thwarted by people's decisions. And then we've got rainwater tanks in Brisbane as a tremendous success. That's going to make a significant difference. And things like grey water and pool covers are still relatively underutilized. Energy efficiency, the major appliances that people have put in are insulation and compact fluorescent lights, and of course that is only going to increase in the new regulatory environment. But then energy efficient white goods, electronic equipment only moderately endorsed, and then solar, hot water, and panels really low. Okay, the three factors that are clearly seen in terms of the choices that people are making every day are their favorable attitudes. Everyone's favorable, but the more favorable you are, the more you have these strong attitudes and reported behavior. Supportive social norms, both at the community level, but also at the household level. And people's self-efficacy, which is their sense that they know what to do. And that's particularly important for those efficiency behaviors, because once people have a vague desire to do something for a sustainable household, they really value, as we'll see in a moment, having someone come through with a checklist and say, these are the 5 things you need to install, these are the 5 behaviors you need to change. What prevents them from turning intentions into action are their bad habits and the household culture. So when we look at water and energy, we're able to see a really useful discrepancy there, where water is a success story in the last 3 years, but energy is a failure. That is, people report that their water use has gone radically down, and that's of course supported by what we know about water use in Melbourne and Brisbane. At the same time, they report that their energy use has gone up. So it's not the case that they're just, lying to make themselves look good. They have some grasp on what's happening in their households. So the major reason why people were able to make radical downward changes in their water was the sense of urgency created by the environmental crises in Brisbane and Melbourne. So again, our data is collected in 2009, and we're talking about the previous 3 years before the big flooding this year. The commitment to protecting the environment is something that's sort of a latent positive factor. If it was absent, the behavior wouldn't have happened, but it's not sufficient to create the change. Government regulation was vital. Yep, thank you. And at the same time, there's some issues about how to do that effectively that we'll talk about if there's time. And the other issue where government was really important was in promulgating the awareness of how to save water. So again, just where do people need to put their energy? What simple steps do they need to make? What appliances do they need to install? And this combination of the urgency created by the water context and their environmental concern with the new procedural knowledge and efficiency appliances, that was what drove people's lower water usage. At the same time, when we look at the energy context, most people report that it stayed the same or went up, which is of course the case. It's growing, and it's growing because people are using more and more things that require energy, but it's also growing because of wasteful choices that people are making. And so the few households that said that they are saving energy compared to the last 3 years commented that they're motivated by their commitment to protecting the environment and their awareness of ways to save energy. But that leverage, right, comes in through their decisions to install these efficiency appliances, which is a major potential opportunity for positive change. I talked about government regulation. People have really strong views about what is best. They like positive incentives, then they like regulation, and they least like pricing. So this is a concern because governments like to put in pricing, right? Because it kind of, they think that consumers will not blame them for the cost. So when we talk about the relationship of intentions to behavior, as psychologists, we're also interested in whether the behavior is sustainably maintained. And one of that is whether it becomes habitual, whether it becomes normative within a community, but the other one is just simply preventing a backlash. So if there's an intervention which creates a backlash, it's not the case that the worst case scenario is intentions don't translate into behavior. The worst case scenario is that the favorable attitudes are eroded and intentions decrease and the behavior is rejected. And of course, you get fired as a policymaker. So when we see this context where people are saying they dislike pricing, this is people's report of what they prefer, what they think is appropriate to handle crises in energy, water, and waste, then we have this important trade-off where what they want is a kind of series of free appliances and gifts, but then what they're being offered is the opportunity to pay more. So this is a very interesting problem that we could talk for a lot longer about. It's not the case that they don't think there's a role for government. The thing with pricing, there are two reasons why they hate pricing. One of them is because it allows rich people to waste, which is kind of offensive. And another one is that they fear that there's a kind of inelastic quality to their own and other people's energy, water, and waste, that they're not going to be able to shrink their consumption. So these are the kinds of things that people say qualitatively. Yes, if the laws change, I'd have to change. So that's why I like regulation. And also, it's great when a tradie comes in and tells me what's wrong with the house, right? So I want to do something for the environment, but I don't know. And if someone can come in, like we had in government programs, and just come in for a small fee and just say, you need to have insulation, you need to put in low flow shower heads, these are the things you need to do, tick. In that trust context, people really, really like that, and there's a real window of change. But at the same time, they fear that it's all going to come down to paying more. And of course, that's realistic. It will cost more. The question is how that cost is shared. How much time do I have?
2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll just talk a little bit then about the broader social context with this carrot versus stick approach to interventions. The good thing about incentives is that people do love incentives. But the problem is sometimes it's only the people that were already motivated to change that actually take up the change. So there's no imperative for the people that don't care or don't have the energy. So you have your highly motivated pro-environmental people installing solar panels and getting the money back. But everyone else is left out of that, right? The problem with enforced change is that it can generate this backlash, which can actually undermine commitment to the entire area. So with this carbon tax debate, it's impossible to know how it's going to unfold, but one thing that seems to be significant is this massive backlash where people are actually some people are withdrawing from their commitment to sustainability because of the political debate and the negative emotions. Having said that, oftentimes enforced change has delivered success, and that's particularly the case when combined with that message of public urgency and a crisis. And the water context in Queensland, in Melbourne, is the obvious success story. People have a sense that the government is helping them to make a change that they want to make, that they value, that the society wants. And what's really important there is the kind of normative context, psychologists would say. So I'm just going to close with this slide. There's two types of social norms. There's what everybody else is doing and what everybody else thinks should be done. And when they diverge, like everyone knows you should save energy, but everyone knows Australians are wasteful, that's often the signal for the social conflict. Those are the areas of social conflict, right? Australians should eat healthily, but they're not eating healthily. They should eat 7 serves of fruits and veg, but they're not. So those divergences signal the social conflict at a given time. And the opportunity for shift comes when the descriptive norm changes. So the injunctive norm often changes first, the prescriptive norm. People have a sense of you should be sustainable. But it's that momentum of change in the descriptive norm that is the tipping point, right? So this is the favorable climate when the prescriptive norm is changed. But you need to have that start of momentum building at a household level for the descriptive norm to change. And that has happened in water. It hasn't happened in energy. So there's a lot to learn from those areas. And I think I'll just flip ahead to the conclusion slide. Household sustainability, the problem is in the intention to behavior link now. Attitudes are favorable, and many people have already integrated habitual daily conservation. A large minority of the sample was motivated by a sense of urgency related to the crisis events and by the interventions for procedural knowledge and efficiency to put in fantastic energy appliances which have helped to decrease resource use. But people are undermining that change. They're undermining that change by not using the technology that they've installed and also by, in some cases, treating it as a license to waste more because they've got this free pass. Interventions that are about voluntary change are going to attract more support from householders. That doesn't mean that they'll work effectively, or there's a tension there. But for us, the normative context is the most interesting, and I'd be happy to riff about that in the discussion or anything else. Thank you. Oh, gotcha.